Hello, my name is Heath Harvey, and this is my video presentation for CPSC 4733. Um, I am doing my presentation on the right to be forgotten. Um, I think most of you probably have read in the book in chapter 2 about the right to be forgotten, or at least you've heard of it before. If not, then I can give you a little bit of background information. So basically, the internet keeps all of our information, all of our pictures, embarrassing pictures, that we have on social media, um, rants on Facebook, stupid things people say on Twitter, um, even when somebody gets arrested, that goes. It's out there. All of that is out there, and it's saved, and it's presumably out there forever. And so the issue of the right to be forgotten first came up. Originally, it was established by an EU ruling, the European Union, in 2014 after a man from Spain wanted to delete an auction notice of his repossessed house that dated back to 1998. In his case, he had resolved all his debts and he basically wanted to get a clean slate, so to speak. And in that case was ruled the judgment of the European Union. They ruled in favor of the European citizens being able to ask search engines and that kind of company to remove any links to content that might be considered inadequate, irrelevant, or excessive, is how they put it. And so from that ruling, it started kind of a global conversation on whether or not individuals had the right to, for what they termed the right to be forgotten, which is like in his case, after you cleaned and absolved yourself of whatever wrongdoing or whatever it was in an individual's certain case, whether or not you had the right to have that stuff expunged from the internet forever and basically get a clean slate. Now, that seems like a really good idea, and I think that it has a lot of merit, but for my presentation, I wanted to go into how I wanted to argue for a position against the right to be forgotten being a realistic or viable concept right now. Okay, so first, I think that it makes for a bad law. In the case of the European Union, it doesn't really do much. The law, first of all, only pertains to citizens of Europe and the European Union. Moreover, it puts the problem that's really on a government scale in the hands and on the shoulders of a corporation, which corporations are inherently driven by profit, and them having to be able to clean up these right to be forgotten cases is expensive. So I mean, they're not really. I think the best way would be to put it that they don't really have a reason to conduct themselves really fairly in these cases. I think since the European passed the law in 2014, Google has had over 650,000 requests to have information removed, and in those cases, they have to pay for the man hours and stuff for each of these cases to be reviewed, and that just it eats up profit. So they're going to be looking at it I mean, these people aren't government officials. They're not elected or anything like that. They're just people who happen to work at Google, and they're deciding whether or not something ethically needs to be removed from the internet or not. So, I mean, it's basically getting a room of people, strangers, and deciding whether or not this information is viable enough to be removed from the internet or not. Um, and I think that gets very complicated whenever you get not something that's not incredibly regulated. When you just have a group of people deciding basically somebody's fate in that way, I think that it can be very unfair. Um, I Oh, and also the information that Google deletes, they only delete it. They only delete the indexes and the links to the information in Europe, so it can still be accessed. The information, whatever they've deemed to be removed, it can still be accessed. All you have to do, even if you're in Europe, you'd have to type in, say, I think Europe's is the .co uk, and all you'd have to do is type in, or all they would have to, somebody would have to do if they really wanted to, is type in, google.com, which is the American version, and that's not blocked. They can still access all the information, so it's kind of pointless in a way, because it's all still there. It didn't do anything. It's kind of putting a band-aid on a huge problem. um, Secondly, it's not globally enforceable. The internet's everywhere. It's all over, and this is a global issue. So no one government really has the right to govern the world. It can't apply everywhere. So, I mean, this is the way it kind of starts encroaching on certain individual freedoms, and sovereign freedoms of different countries, because you can't violate their laws. Um, there's a group, a human rights group called Article 19, and they're in the EU. And while this, after the law was passed, it's during the debate of who gets to govern this, since it is still accessible in other countries. The European Union wants Google to force Google to apply this globally. So the Article 19 group argued that the EU shouldn't be allowed to dictate what internet users around the world see whenever they use a search engine. It opens up a whole can of worms on freedom of speech, that being the first. If you let one government dictate how what internet users see, what's okay to be on the internet, it kind of opens up the gates for more authoritarian regimes like Russia or Saudi Arabia to kind of put more restrictions on their citizens. And that's, that's not really something anybody wants. But I mean, just for an instance, if you do it for one country, everybody's going to be able to do that kind of thing. It will open up a precedent for, I guess, a more global censorship. So that would also, I believe, I mean, that would also violate the sovereign laws of other countries. You can't just have one country dictate. And that kind of leads into another point I have, which is, say the U.S., for instance, our laws, our First Amendment guarantees our freedom of speech, and this would kind of encroach upon that. Let's see. For instance, there are legal cases that have been fought with one being the Martin versus the Hearst Corporation. That was in 2015. In this case, Lorraine Martin was arrested with her two sons on drug allegations, or drug charges, sorry, not allegations. And when that happened, there are, of course, news articles written about it mentioning her. And in this particular case, the state decided not to prosecute for whatever reason. So when that happened, the charges were expunged from her record or removed from her record. Well, she in turn wanted the news organization that had written about her to remove the articles, and they refused. So when they refused, she decided to sue them. And in this case, the court ruled, I want to get this right, so the court ruled that because the articles were historically accurate, they did not have to be removed. And this is because it fell on a precedent case of the Florida Star versus BJF in 1989. I think there were two other court cases in 1975 and 1979, which guaranteed a freedom of press, which was the court held that because of these previous rulings, forcing the press to remove truthful information would violate the First Amendment and would constitute a form of compelled speech, which is imprisonable under the First Amendment. So it's already been shown in our country to at least to violate certain rights and laws that would, it would just become a global phenomenon, a mess, basically. So these are my reasons. That's kind of my reasoning for arguing that the right to be forgotten is not a viable or really realistic goal right now. It is a bad law, essentially. It's kind of half-cocked. At least the European rulings is, because it's causing actually more problems and not really solving anything. There's a giant workaround. It's not globally enforceable. Even if it were globally enforceable, it would create an atmosphere that I don't think anybody would really want, which would be an atmosphere of global censorship on the internet. And I think that would be an injustice for everyone. It violates sovereign laws, freedom of press, freedom of speech here in the U.S., for instance, the First Amendment, and it opens the door for oppressive regimes to take away more freedoms from their citizens, and it yeah. Sorry, that's all.